I'm a sophomore at Bennett Academy. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to do this interview. Would you please provide your name and some of your background information about your education and career?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So, name is Ryan Clark. I'm currently the president and managing director of GenStar Capital. GenStar is a private equity firm based in San Francisco. I graduated Harvard College with a major in environmental science. I worked in investment banking at Morgan Stanley before I went into private equity with a firm called Hellman and Friedman. I went to Harvard Business School, graduated 2004, and then I've been at GenStar for the last 16 years.
Thank you. Now, I was wondering if I could ask you some questions about business ethics and how ethics have helped you answer questions or make decisions as a business leader. If that's fine with you.
Yep.
Do you have a set of ethical principles that you use when faced with difficult questions or situations in your career?
It's an interesting question. I don't have a formal set of guidelines that I go through, but I'd say I have sort of two ethical standards that I use. One is sort of an internal sense of what's right versus wrong, and I'll get into that, but that's very much contextual. So it's not always like there's always this answer is always the right one. It very much depends on context and environment. The second sort of framework that I've used is what we call the Wall Street Journal test, which is whatever decision you're making, the outcome of which, if it were published in the Wall Street Journal, how would you feel about it, right? And so there's a question of, if there's a gray zone about making a decision, and you're debating, well, which should I do, this way or that way? And you're like, well, how would you feel if this way were published in the Wall Street Journal? How would you feel if that way were published in the Wall Street Journal? So it gives you some sort of recognition that there's an ethical standard, there's a community standard, there's a moral standard that you're being held to as you make these decisions. That nothing's done in isolation. So the first one's really more an internal, my sense of what's right or wrong in a given situation, and that's from a whole sort of moral code that's developed throughout life. But then the second is definitely more of an explicit, okay, reputationally, who do we want to be? If this action is videoed and broadcast, how would we feel about it?
Okay, thank you. Would you be able to provide an example of a situation in your business career that you faced in which you applied these principles?
Yeah. So a couple. One is not mine, but I will bring this up because I thought it was just exemplary of ethical behavior. We had a CEO of a company. We sold his company, and as part of selling it, we had to distribute all the cash to the stockholders, of which he was one. He called me up one day and said, "Ryan, I got my distribution, and I did the calculation, and I think you sent me too much money." He says, "I think I was overpaid." And I reflected on this, and I said, "That's incredible. A lot of people, they wouldn't have even done the math to figure it out, but then he did the math and not only said, 'This isn't right. You paid me too much.' A lot of people probably would have said, 'Oh, they made a mistake, but that's their mistake, and I've got the money.'" And so he is one of the more ethical leaders that I've encountered. And if I was applying those two standards, the right versus wrong in the Wall Street Journal, I think he just has a very strong sense of what's right and what's fair. And if he got too much, that meant that someone else didn't get enough. And then in the Wall Street Journal, if it did turn out that, hey, if this were in the Journal and I knew that I was overpaid and I didn't tell anybody, I think you do want, if you had that sort of public flashlight, you'd want to have done, quote, the right thing and return that. An example on mine, the biggest, and I don't know whether this is ethical or sort of moral, but we run into sort of conflicts of interest. They're called conflicts of interest, right? Where if we take one action, it might hurt another party. If we do this action, it might hurt a different party. And there's always trade-offs, right? There's never any black and white answers, and there's always sort of gray zones. But I found that what's most important when you have these conflicts is to fully disclose to both parties hey, I'm making a decision. Um, just so you know, I do have an interest in this, but I'm making the decision based on your interests and your fairness. And I think that as I've gone through life, it's very hard to sort of say this is the right and this is the wrong. But I do think it's important to be transparent, as you're working these situations. So anyway, that's the only other example I'll bring up is um, working with people that haven't worked out at our firm, and we have this in all companies, right? Where someone is a good person, their people like them, they're doing a good job, but they're not living up to the standards that you're requiring of them. And I think the business answer is just you fire him and move on, him or her. The ethical side of me says, not only give them a chance, give them some fair warning, give them an opportunity to remediate, but then if they do remediate, really try to recognize that they're in a hard situation and sort of help them purposefully into their next step, however that might be.
Okay.
And you can take an unethical lens and just fire people and not care, but I think an ethical approach that I've tried to embody is caring about the individual and trying to help them in any way while recognizing that they're not going to be on the team.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you for your input on that. Do you think that any particular business question, decision, or situation represents a difficult ethical issue?
Not always. No, not always. I think there are some decisions that you make that are very clearly what I'll call the right decision, and they're win-win-win for everybody. And you could have it on the Wall Street Journal, and that was the right decision, right? It's just, so I don't think. I think you get ethical decisions when, as I mentioned, there's conflicts of interest, there's gray areas. There I think where something unfair, something could be perceived as unfair, like in the payment when someone was paid more. But thankfully, in business, it's all geared around maximizing profits, doing right by employees, doing right by customers, and doing right by your shareholders. And generally, I found that most decisions, those are all aligned. You can, by serving the customer, you're doing right by your profits, you're doing right by your employees, you're doing right by your shareholders. So most decisions you actually make are sort of right for everyone. Sometimes, and maybe 10% of the times, you run into these sort of, again, conflicts where, okay, I'm doing this right by the customer, but it might hurt our profit, or I'm doing right by profit, but it might hurt a customer, employee, and that's when you start to run into trade-offs, and that's where sort of ethical dilemmas come in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do you have any advice that you could provide for me as I think about ethical issues that I may face one day in my career?
Yeah, and I'll pass along the advice I had. I was a summer intern. This was in college, and I worked for the CEO of a technology company in San Diego, and he told me, no matter what you do, in business, always be honest with your accounts. So always be honest with your expense accounts. Always be honest with your time. And he said that because he said, look, your reputation and your integrity takes forever to build, but it can go away very quickly. And that's what I've actually found in my business, is that reputation matters. How you treat people, how you make decisions. Can people trust your decision making? Can people trust that what you're going to do is fair? Especially internally, when you deal with compensation, people want to make sure that you're being fair, you're being consistent. And so, I would encourage you to have that same lens of always strive to be fair, always strive to be honest. Don't take shortcuts, don't fudge the numbers. Keep everything straight and on the up. The second thing that I would say is where I've been most upset by people in my industry is when we've verbally agreed to something and then they don't follow through on that. So as an example, two people shake hands and say, hey, if you buy this for 100, I'll sell it to you. And that's happened in our industry. And we've actually had moments where people have agreed verbally and then ultimately they got a better offer, say, oh, I got it for 110, so our deal's off. And that to me is very frustrating because, again, back to what my comment was, your word and your integrity is everything. And so if you give someone your word and someone your handshake, I found live up to that, honor that person, honor that commitment you've made. even if there might be a quote better offer. And that is an ethical decision. Should you honor the commitment you've made to someone, or should you take a new and better offer? And people choose both ways. My personal bias is to honor the person and the commitment, and that in the end that's not only the right thing, but in the end it'll actually serve you even better.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for all that advice and all for your time. It was absolutely amazing. This has been very helpful, and I look forward to maybe seeing you again.
Okay, nice to meet you, Luke. Happy to help out.
Thank you so much for everything, really. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Luke.